On the bright, crowded morning, a rich man decided to build his own generosity on the back of a poor woman's shame. The wealthy developer who ran the glossy charity everyone in the district was talking about stood up on the stage of a packed hall before the whole community, looked down at a poor single mother who braided hair from a plastic stool for a living, and told the gathered room that she was a joke, that her application for his life-changing shop prize was an embarrassment, that a girl with no shop and no papers and no schooling and nothing but a plastic stool and a comb had no business standing among serious traders, and that the sooner she withdrew and sat down, the sooner the district could get on with awarding the shop to someone who actually deserved it. Ngozi Achebe did not weep, and she did not beg, and she did not run, though the laughter he had invited was already rippling across the hall at her back. She stood at the front, with her small braiding tin held against her chest, the same battered tin she had carried through every lean year, combs and thread and a few coins, and, knotted quietly inside it, one cheap blue glass bead she had kept for reasons she had never told anyone, and let his mockery break over her, because there was nothing a poor braiding girl could say into that laughter and that powerful man's stage that the amused room was ready to hear. And the developer performing his contempt did not know, and the laughing hall did not know, that the fixed little show he was running had a witness he had never noticed, that somewhere among the quiet judges at the panel table sat one plain, unremarkable old woman, whose life this same braiding girl had once pulled out of a flood in the dark for nothing, who was about to know that face, and who would rise at the right hour and tell that whole hall exactly who the nobody they were laughing at truly was. The hall did the thing a crowd does when a big man with money laughs at a small woman first. It laughed with him. The well-dressed traders and the curious neighbors and the people who had come for the free show of a charity prize giving looked at Ngozi in her faded wrapper, on her feet at the front, with a comb and thread tin instead of a folder of papers, and they took their cue from the man on the stage, because a rich man's amusement is contagious, and it is always easier to laugh along with power than to stand beside the one being laughed at. A few of the older women near the back did not laugh. They frowned and looked at their hands, because they had daughters who braided hair, and they knew what it cost to stand up at all. But most of the room went with the chief, because that is how a fixed thing is made to look fair. You get the crowd to agree the poor woman was never a real contender in the first place, and then no one asks how the winner was really chosen. And Ngozi felt the heat climb up her neck, and the tin press hard against her ribs, and inside her, quiet and steady under all the noise, the one thing the laughter could not reach. She knew what she was. She had braided hair honestly for 8 years, learned her trade until her twists held for weeks, and her cornrows ran straight as ruled lines, raised her child on it without begging or stealing, and never once cheated a customer of a naira. She lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her over a plaited head when she was small, and she said nothing aloud, because a woman who has nursed a stranger through 3 nights for nothing has already learned that the loudest room is not always the one that decides things. The developer thought he was managing a small nuisance the way he managed every nuisance, by deciding who was low enough to be embarrassed, and doing it from a stage where no one would argue. He had looked at the list of applicants for his prize, seen a braiding girl with no registered business and no schooling past a certain point, and decided, long before the selection day, that she was exactly the sort of harmless little embarrassment he could hold up to make his fixed result look like a fair one. He had spent his whole comfortable life looking at people like Ngozi and seeing not what they carried, but how usefully they could be made small. Ngozi Achebe was 28 years old, and on that corner she was known by nearly everyone and truly seen by almost no one, the braiding girl on the settlement corner, the one who sat on a low plastic stool under a faded market umbrella and plaited cornrows and twists and weaves from first light until the light went. She rose each morning before the corner filled, in the single rented room where she lived with her child, swept her small patch of ground, set out her stool and her low bench and her tin of combs and thread and beads, and braided all day for a few hundred naira a head, taking so thin that one slow week could leave the tin nearly empty. She was, everyone who sat under her hands agreed, honest and gifted, exact with her partings, gentle with a tender scalp, the kind of braider who would loosen a plait that pulled too hard for nothing, and finish a child's hair after dark rather than send them home half done. And she had learned long ago that being poor, and being good at a humble thing at the same time, only meant people used your hands and forgot your name. The braiding girl, they called her, half in fondness, and most of them did not know the half of what she carried, nor what one flooded night years before had cost her, nor what she had quietly done in it. She had not been handed her trade. No one hands a poor girl a living. She had built it herself, over years, the way the poor build anything that lasts, slowly, with sacrifice, and with far more discipline than the comfortable ever imagined the poor possess. She had learned to braid as a girl at her mother's side, and when she found herself alone with a child to raise, she had made those hands into her whole livelihood. One stool, one umbrella, one tin, and a name for good honest work that spread slowly by word of mouth from head to head down the settlement. She saved what she could in an old tin, a little each good week toward the one thing she wanted in the world, to lift her child off the thin floor of that rented room, and into a life with a proper roof and school fees paid without fear. She used to think, plaiting in the early light, that her hands were the one thing no one could take from her, and that to do honest work well in a hard place was a small good thing worth holding to. She kept her few coins and her combs and her thread the way she kept everything, quietly, carefully, without fuss, and knotted on a thread among them she kept one cheap blue glass bead, and she had never told a living soul why. Because there had been, years before, a night Ngozi never spoke of. It was the height of the rains, a night when the gutters burst and the road ran like a river, and the whole settlement was ankle-deep and then knee-deep in filthy rushing water, and people ran for higher ground and shuttered their doors. And on that flooded road, half carried by the water against a wall, there had been an old woman, a soaked, shivering, half-drowned old market woman, feverish and confused, no younger and no stronger than anyone's grandmother, that the running, frightened people stepped around and passed in the dark. Because it was a night to save yourself and yours. Ngozi, waiting home, had not stepped around her. She had waited to the old woman, got an arm under her, and half dragged, half carried her out of the water and through the rain to her own single room. The only shelter she had. She did not know her. She had nothing to gain. She simply could not leave a drowning old woman in the water while she had a dry floor. Here is the very thing this channel was built for, so let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever done a good thing quietly, for nobody's eyes, expecting nothing back, helped a stranger, given what little you had, sat up in the dark for someone who could never repay you, and then watched a powerful person mock you as if kindness and poverty were the same as worthlessness, then you already belong here with us, under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the quiet, overlooked people who do good in the dark and get laughed at in the light are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what a rich man's mockery was about to do to Ngozi Achebe on that stage, or what one old woman among the judges was about to do right back. That flood night, Ngozi had done more than pull the old woman from the water. She had dried her and wrapped her in her own only spare wrapper. And when the fever climbed through the night, and the old woman shook and rambled and could not hold down water, Ngozi had gone back out into the rain in the small hours to wake a chemist she knew, and spend the little she had saved in that tin on fever medicine and salts. And she had made thin broth and spooned it between the old woman's lips, and she had sat up on the floor beside her through that night and the next and the one after, cooling her forehead and holding her hand and telling her she was safe, until the fever finally broke and the confusion cleared, and the old woman opened her eyes and knew where she was. And when the old woman was well enough, days later, to stand and go, she had looked at Ngozi with a long, strange, searching look, and taken both her hands, and asked her name, and blessed her in the old way, and said, in a voice still weak, that a kindness like this was not a small thing, and would not stay a small thing forever. And Ngozi, embarrassed, had only helped her to the road and watched her go, and never learned her full name, and told no one what she had done, because you do not nurse a drowning stranger for 3 nights in order to have a story to tell. She had thought that was the end of it. All she had kept of it was the bead. After the old woman had gone, sweeping her room, Ngozi had found on the floor one small blue glass bead, fallen from a broken waist string the flood must have snapped, and she had knotted it on a thread and kept it in her tin. Not because it was worth anything, for it was worth nothing, but because it was the only thing left in her hands from the one time in her poor, overlooked life she had felt she had done something that truly mattered. Through every lean year after, when the corner was slow and the tin was thin, and she wondered whether being good was worth the price the poor pay for it, she would sometimes feel that little blue bead among the coins and remember that she had once pulled a life out of a flood for nothing, and it steadied her. That was what she carried into the crowded hall on the prize day. Honest hands, a clean name, a plastic stool, a tin of combs and thread, and one cheap blue bead she had never explained to anyone. To understand the woman standing shamed at the front of that hall, you have to understand the man on the stage who put her there. His name was Chief Obiora Nwabueze, a wealthy property developer in his 50s, who had thrown up estates and plazas across the city and built a great fortune doing it, addressed as chief by everyone who wanted anything from him. He was not, to look at him, a wicked man. He sat on boards and gave to his church, and had lately wrapped himself in a bright, well-photographed charitable foundation, forever cutting ribbons and handing over cheques with a smile for the cameras. But under the finagbada and the easy public warmth, he was a man who had never once imagined he could be in the wrong, and who measured every person near him by whether they polished his image or threatened it. His newest scheme was a modern market plaza on the edge of the settlement, and to launch it with the right kind of publicity he had announced a prize through his foundation, one fully built, fully stocked shop unit in the new market, awarded, he swore up and down, fairly and on merit, to the single most deserving small trader in the whole district. The cruelty on that stage did not come from a criminal. It came from a respectable big man who had turned his own generosity into a lie and needed a poor woman to make the lie look like the truth, which is a colder and more dangerous thing. And there was one more person who matters, though every eye in that hall was pointed the wrong way, because she was exactly the kind of person a room full of people looking for importance does not see. Among the quiet panel of judges seated to one side of the stage, the foundation's officers, a banker, a district official, and a scatter of guests, there sat one plain, unremarkable elderly woman in a good, but not showy gel, her hands folded, her eyes moving slowly over the proceedings, saying nothing. Nobody in the crowd gave her a second glance. She looked like somebody's aunt brought along to fill a chair. But she was not somebody's aunt brought to fill a chair. She was Madame Felicia Adeyemi, and she was the real reason the prize existed at all. The foundation's principal benefactor, the woman whose family trust had put up the money for the shop, and whose name, though the chief was careful never to say so from the stage, was the one that would sign the final award. She had asked to sit quietly among the panel and simply watch the selection day with her own eyes before she signed anything, because she had learned, in a long life, that you find out most about people when they do not know who is watching. And she had lived, some years before, through one terrible flooded night that she had never fully explained to anyone either. The prize was real, and it was large, and that was the whole trouble. For a genuinely fair contest, an open judging, deserving traders, weighed honestly on merit, was the one thing Chief Obiora had never actually intended to run. Because he had already promised the shop, in the quiet way such men promise things, to his own polished protégé, a smooth, well-dressed young relation of his who fronted one of his ventures, and whom he wanted set up in the new market as his creature. The foundation, the applications, the public selection day were all staging. A fair-looking show wrapped around a decision already made. But Madame Felicia's trust held the purse, and Madame Felicia had insisted, to the chief's private irritation, on a genuine open selection with real applicants judged in public, and had chosen to attend herself and watch. So the chief needed the public day to reach the result he had already fixed while looking, to her and to the district and to the cameras, entirely fair. And the surest way to make a fixed result look fair is to have the crowd agree, out loud, that the poor applicants were never serious in the first place. And there, on the list, was a braiding girl with a plastic stool and no papers, the perfect nobody to hold up, humiliate, and dismiss. So that when his protégé's name was read, the whole hall would nod along that of course the shop had gone to someone who deserved it. And so, with the benefactor watching and the cameras rolling and the crowd warmed up, Chief Obiora did the thing such men do. The quiet, ordinary cruelty that grinds the poor down in that city every day, only dressed this time in the bright clothes of charity. He had the shortlist read, and the serious-looking candidates spoken of respectfully, and then he came to Ngozi's name, and he made a show of it. He called her up to the front, and he looked her over, the faded wrapper, the braiding tin, the low plastic stool one of his stewards carried up behind her as a prop for the joke. And he asked her, into the microphone, where her shop was, and where her business registration was, and how far she had gone in school, and what on earth had made her imagine that plaiting hair on a stool by the road belonged in the same contest as real traders. He did not want her answers. He wanted the laughter, and he got it, and he let it run, and he told her, kindly, as if doing her a favor, that the honest thing would be for her to withdraw her application now and save herself further embarrassment, and go back to her corner where she belonged. And the awful machinery of it turned, not an engine of steel this time, but the older machinery, the one that turns an honest poor woman into a joke the instant a rich man needs one. Ngozi stood in that laughter and did not withdraw. When the chief finished and waited for her to shrink and mumble and flee, she did not. She lifted her chin, and she answered him, plainly and steadily, into the microphone he had not really meant to let her use. She said that she had no shop yet, which was exactly why she had applied for one, that she had braided hair honestly for 8 years and raised her child on it and never cheated a soul. That her business was her 2 hands and her name, and that both were good, and that she had understood the notice to say the prize was for the most deserving trader in the district, not the one with the most papers, and that if being poor and doing honest work well was a thing to be laughed at, then she supposed the joke was on a great many people in that hall who worked as hard as she did. And that, she would think later, was the moment the room went quiet for the first time, not because the crowd had turned, not yet, but because a braiding girl had answered a chief on his own stage without her voice shaking, and something in the plainness of it made even the laughers glance at one another. The chief's smile tightened. This was not the meek withdrawal he had staged, but he was a man who had crushed 100 small defiances, and he moved to crush this one, leaning into the microphone to put her back in her place with a harder word. And it was in exactly that silence, as Ngozi's plain, steady voice still hung in the air of the hall, that the thing the chief had never accounted for began. For at the panel table, the plain old woman in the good gel had gone very still. She had not been listening idly. From the moment the braiding girl was called up and made to stand at the front, something in that face, that build, that particular set of the chin under mockery, had been working at the edges of an old woman's memory. And when Ngozi spoke, when she heard that voice say plainly that her business was her 2 hands and her name, and that both were good, Madame Felicia Adeyemi knew. She knew the way you know a face you last saw bent over you in a fever in the dark. A face that had told you, years ago, on the worst night of your life, that you were safe. And a small blue glass bead, knotted on a thread in a battered braiding tin the girl was clutching to her chest, was a detail Madame Felicia could not have seen from the panel table. But she did not need to see it, because she was already rising to her feet. This is the moment the channel was built to make you feel. So sit with it for one breath before we go on. Because if you have ever done a quiet good thing for a stranger in the dark, asking nothing, telling no one, and half believed as the hard years passed that a kindness done for nothing simply vanishes into nothing, then you already know exactly how the air in that hall changed as one plain old woman no one had bothered to look at pushed back her chair and stood. If you've made it this far into Ngozi's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Chief Obiora did not, at first, understand what was happening. He saw an old panel guest getting to her feet in the middle of his careful show, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face, because no one was supposed to interrupt the stage but him. He half turned, ready to smooth over whatever small confusion this was, perhaps to gently seat the old woman again. But Madame Felicia was not looking at him at all. She was looking at Ngozi, and her lined face had come open with something the whole front of the hall could see even before she spoke: astonishment, and then a fierce, brimming tenderness, and then something very close to tears. And the room, which a moment before had been laughing, felt the change the way a crowd always feels it when someone who is not supposed to matter suddenly, unmistakably does. And it went from restless to silent, every head turning from the girl at the front to the old woman rising at the panel table. For here is the thing Chief Obiora had forgotten, in his contempt, and the thing that would undo him. He had built his whole fixed show on the certainty that the braiding girl was a nobody, that no one in that hall of any weight could possibly have a reason to take her side, that her poverty was the same as being powerless, and that a woman with a plastic stool could be safely laughed at because no one who mattered would ever stand for her. It had not occurred to him, as it does not occur to such men, that the plain old woman he had grudgingly seated on his own panel to keep his benefactor happy, and the drowning stranger a braiding girl had once carried out of a flood in the dark for nothing, might be the very same person, that the dead of that night, unclaimed and unknown, had been sitting quietly at his own judge's table the whole morning, waiting. The chief had spent his life sure that the poor could be shamed without consequence. He had never once imagined that a good deed done for nothing years ago could walk into his charity, take a chair, and rise. And there was no one better place to rise. In the years since that flooded night, Madame Felicia Adeyemi's fortunes had turned all the way around. She had been, when Ngozi found her, an old market trader fallen on the hardest of times, ill and adrift and nearly alone in the world. But she came, in truth, of a family with property and standing. And after that illness, her people had gathered her back in, and a long tangled family inheritance had at last come right, and she had spent her later years as the quiet, shrewd matriarch of a family trust with land and money and a name. She had never forgotten the girl who pulled her from the water. She had gone back, once she was strong, to the settlement to find her, and had missed her, and lost the thread of her in the churn of that huge city, and had carried, ever since, an old woman's unpaid debt, and a private wish that one day she might repay a kindness she had never been able to return. She had not known, walking into that hall as its unnamed benefactor to watch a prize be given fairly, that the debt she carried was about to walk up onto the stage in a faded wrapper and be laughed at to her face. Madame Felicia Adeyemi rose to her full height at the panel table, and she did the thing no one in that hall expected, least of all the man on the stage. She asked, in the clear, unhurried voice of an old woman who has money and time and nothing left to fear, that the proceedings stop for a moment, because she had something to say to the room. And the room gave it to her. The way a room gives way to authority it can suddenly feel, but cannot yet place. And the chief, not yet understanding, still assuming this old guest was on his side, made a gracious gesture, inviting her to speak, a courtesy he would spend the rest of his life wishing he had swallowed. She turned first to Ngozi. "Child," she said, and her voice shook only a little, "look at me. Look at my face. Do you know me?" And Ngozi, bewildered, looked, truly looked, at the old woman for the first time, past the good Jeel, and the folded hands to the eyes, and the bones of the face. And the years fell away, and her own face broke open, and the braiding tin nearly slipped from her hands. Because she did know her, older, well, dressed now in fine cloth, but the same, the old woman from the flood, the drowning stranger she had carried home and nursed through 3 nights and helped to the road and never seen again. "Ma," Ngozi whispered, and could say no more. And Madame Felicia, weeping openly now and not ashamed of it, turned from the girl to the hall and told them. She told them plainly, in the voice of someone for whom the truth costs nothing to say, exactly who this braiding girl was. She told them about a night, some years before, of terrible flooding, when she had been old and ill and fallen on the worst days of her life, and had been swept against a wall in the running water on a settlement road, feverish and half-drowned, while frightened people ran past and stepped around her in the dark. And she told them how one young woman, this young woman, the one they had just spent their morning laughing at, had not stepped around her, but had waded into that filthy water, and lifted her, and carried her to her own single room, and dried her, and wrapped her in her own only spare wrapper, and gone back out into the rain in the middle of the night to spend the last of her own small savings on medicine, and had sat on the floor beside a drowning stranger for 3 nights, holding her hand, telling her she was safe until the fever broke, and had then asked for nothing, told no one, and let her walk away without so much as keeping her full name. This woman, Madame Felicia said to the silent hall, her hand flung out toward Ngozi exactly where the chief's mocking hand had pointed an hour before, this braiding girl with the plastic stool that you have been laughing at all morning. This woman saved my life. She saved my life, and she never once came looking for a reward. And you have stood here and called her a nobody. The hall, which had come to watch a poor woman shamed, sat in a silence so complete you could hear the ceiling fans. Because there is a thing that happens to a crowd when it realizes all at once that it has been laughing on the wrong side. A hot, ashamed stillness. 100 people unable to look at the girl they had mocked and unable to look away. And into that silence Madame Felicia turned, at last, and looked full at Chief Obiora Nwabweze, and the tenderness went out of her face, and something much older and harder came into it. "And now," she said, "let us talk about your fair contest." For Madame Felicia had not only recognized the girl. Sitting quietly at that panel table all morning, watching with the eyes of a shrewd old woman who had insisted on a genuine selection precisely because she did not entirely trust the man running it, she had seen exactly what kind of show the chief was staging. She had watched him breeze past strong, deserving applicants with a few empty words, and lavish his real attention on one candidate, his own smooth young protégé, spoken of as though the result were already settled. She had watched him single out the poorest, most defenseless applicant on the list, and work the crowd into laughing her off the stage, not to judge her, but to make a foregone conclusion look earned. She had sat through enough of it, before ever she knew the braiding girl's face, to have grown quietly certain that the fair, merit-based selection her own trust was funding had been rigged from the start. And now she said so, out loud, to the whole hall. She told the room that she was the foundation's benefactor, that it was her family's trust that had put up the money for the shop, and her signature, not the chief's, that the final award required, a fact the chief had been careful all morning never to mention from his stage. A ripple went through the hall, and every camera turned, and Chief Obiora's face, for the first time that morning, lost its ease. She told them that she had asked to sit quietly among the panel and watch the selection with her own eyes before she signed anything. Because a long life had taught her to distrust a contest run by a man who had already decided the winner. And she told them what she had watched him do: dismiss deserving traitors, groom his own protege for a result arranged in advance, and humiliate a poor braiding girl into withdrawing so that a fixed outcome would wear the face of a fair one. "You did not run a contest," she said to him plainly, in front of the district and the cameras. "You ran a performance, with my money and my name, to give your own man a shop and dress it up as charity. And to make it look honest, you needed someone to laugh at. You chose her, and she let that hang, and the hall, which had done the laughing he needed, sat in the wreckage of it." Chief Obiora, who had come to hand his protege a shop before an admiring district, and instead found the ground opening under his polished shoes, made the last mistake of a man who has never been contradicted. He tried to bluster over the old woman as he had blustered over the braiding girl, protesting that this was all a great misunderstanding, that the selection was entirely fair, that Madame Felicia was a valued guest who had perhaps mistaken his firmness for something darker, that of course the braiding girl's kindness was very touching, but had nothing to do with the serious business of the prize. But it was too late for that in a room that had just watched the truth stand up and speak. Because a man who has spent the whole morning mocking a poor woman to rig his own charity cannot then pretend the contest was clean. The staging, the props, the laughter he had conducted like a choir, all of it, now, read as exactly what it was. And Madame Felicia, who held the purse and the pen and no longer any patience, cut across his protests with the flat authority of an old woman who has buried better men than him. "The shop," she said, "is mine to award. And I have watched enough this morning to know who has earned it and who has disgraced it." And then came the public accounting, the part this channel does not skip, because a good deed repaid in a whisper is no repayment the world can see. Madame Felicia Adeyemi, before the whole hall and every camera in it, awarded the fully built, fully stocked shop unit in the new market to Ngozi Achebe, not out of pity, she said, and not only out of gratitude, but on the plain merit the chief had tried to laugh away. 8 years of honest work, a trade done well, a name without a stain, and a character the whole district had just seen tested on that stage and found to be solid gold. The debt of the flood night, she said, was her own private matter, and would be paid in its own way. But the shop, she wanted the room to understand, Ngozi had earned as a trader, fair and square, and would have deserved even if the two of them had never met. And she did not stop at the gift. She turned her full attention to the chief's rigged charity and dismantled it in the open. His protege's arranged win was struck down. The foundation's dealings, run through her trust, were placed under her own direct oversight, and she made plain, to the partners and the officials and the press in that hall, that she and her family would not lend their name or their money to a man who would rig his own charity and humiliate the poor to do it. And the consequences did not stop at the hall. Word travelled the way word does, and it travelled fast. Because a video of a rich man mocking a braiding girl who turned out to have saved a judge's life is exactly the kind of thing a city cannot stop passing along. The partners and the banks who had been lending their names and their money to Chief Obiora's bright new market plaza on the strength of his charitable, community-minded image did not care to be seen beside a man exposed before the whole district for rigging his own foundation and shaming the poor for show. The trust withdrew. Sponsors quietly stepped back. The glossy foundation he had wrapped himself in became the thing his name was known for, and not in the way he had paid so much to arrange. His grand development stalled and faltered, and the respectable big man who had measured everyone by their use to his image watched that image do what images do when the truth gets under them: crack and spread and fall. He had pointed at a poor woman to build himself up in public, and the very stage he built for it became the place his own name came down. For Ngozi, the turn was not a windfall so much as a door. The world forced, at last, to admit what she had carried all along. She moved from the plastic stool under the faded umbrella into her own bright, real shop in the new market. And she made of it exactly what everyone who had ever sat under her hands might have guessed she would: a proper braiding salon, clean and busy, with chairs and mirrors, and in time, girls she trained and paid. The honest little trade that had barely fed her turned into a real growing business, with her good name over the door. The customers who had known her on the corner followed her gladly, and new ones came for the braider whose story they had heard, and the takings that had once left her tin empty in a slow week became a living she could build a future on. She took what she earned, and did the one thing it had always been for. She lifted her child off that thin floor and into a real home. A proper roof, school fees paid without the old fear. The clean name she had nearly been laughed out of was hers again, and worth more now for having been tested in front of the whole district and found true. And Madame Felicia paid her private debt in her own way, as she had said she would. Not by making Ngozi a pensioner of her charity, which would have shamed a woman who had never once asked for anything, but by standing beside her as the thing an overlooked braiding girl had never had: a powerful friend who believed in her. The old woman came often to the new shop and sat and had her thinning hair plaited by the same gentle hands that had once nursed her, and the two of them, the matriarch and the braider, became an unlikely, easy pair, bound by a flood night neither had been able to forget, and together they did the thing that turned the whole story into something larger than the two of them. Knowing better than anyone how a single act of care in the dark could change a life, they set up a small, quiet fund out of Madame Felicia's trust and Ngozi's own giving. Not a glossy foundation with ribbons and cameras, but a plain, private hand extended to exactly the sort of overlooked settlement traders the district had learned. That morning, it was so quick to laugh at: a woman with a good trade and no papers, a widow with skilled hands and no capital, the nobodies with something real to offer and no one who mattered to see it. The kindness one drowning night had shown Ngozi. The two of them set out to pass quietly on, over and over, to the next one no one else would carry out of the water. And on an evening months later, when the shop was closed and swept and the new market had gone quiet, Ngozi sat in her own bright salon, with the old braiding tin open on her knees, and lifted out from among the combs and thread the little blue glass bead, knotted still on its faded thread, no longer a poor woman's helpless keepsake. The one small thing she thought she had to show for a night of kindness, done for nothing. But the proof, kept and honored, that a good deed done in the dark for a stranger who could never repay it is never quite done for nothing, and finds its way home in its own hour. Her child slept under a proper roof. In a real home her own two hands had at last been allowed to build. The corner where she had braided on a plastic stool for 8 overlooked years was behind her, and the market laughed at her no longer. And somewhere across the city, a shrewd old woman she had once pulled out of a flood was seeing to it that other overlooked hands got their chance. The bead had come home, and the debt had come home. And the woman they had laughed at the prize day was, in the end, the one the whole district had to admire. And so the fire burns low under the old Baobab tree. Tell me, before you go, when the powerful mock the poor for having nothing, and a quiet kindness done years ago in the dark is what finally lifts them. Do you believe such debts truly find their way home in this life? Or only in the stories we tell under the tree? Stay a while and tell me in the comments where you watched from.